today I'm delighted to welcome Karma Loveday, the editor of the Water Report. Karma, welcome.
Thank you.
It's great to have you as our third thought leader, so it'd be great to have your thoughts on the industry going forward.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
So my first question to you is that you've interviewed a large amount of industry leaders over the years. So what do you think is keeping most water company CEOs up at night?
Well, you're right. Because we're a specialist magazine, I think it's really important that we try to understand individual companies as well as the sector as a whole. Mm-hmm. So I do spend quite a bit of time chatting to CEOs and other leaders. And I suppose with the caveat that they all have their own individual concerns, there are clearly some sector-wide things that I suspect are keeping them up. We're speaking here at the end of November. And there are sort of two pivotal decisions coming in December, just a few days apart from each other. It's a bit like buses, I suppose. You wait for a long time and then two come along at once. So on the 12th of December, we've obviously got the general election. Now that is absolutely critical for the whole country for obvious reasons, but for water specifically, it will be a decider on the ownership question, which has hung over the sector for the last couple of years. So as you'll know, Labour Party policy is now to renationalise the water companies. So either the button will be pressed on that on the 12th of December, or it will effectively be a risk that's receded and perhaps gone away for at least 5 years. So that will be one thing. A few days later, obviously the 16th of December, we have the final determinations from Ofwat. And those kind of 5-yearly price reviews are obviously part and parcel of the landscape. But this time around, I think there are some really interesting questions that review will have to answer. So that will include how we fund resilience and growth going forwards, how stretching you can make targets before they snap, and many other questions. So that would clearly be front of mind for the chief executives that you're talking about right now. I'd like to add one other thing, which is a bit more general, but I would still say urgent, and actually really of higher priority than either of those other two really important things that I've just discussed, and that's their role in addressing the climate emergency, and some people would say nature emergency. So obviously as a sector they have a role to play in decarbonising along with lots of other sectors, but climate change has direct consequences for water in terms of ensuring that we have enough water in the right places, so flooding and drought. So if I was a chief executive, although that's not something that's happening tomorrow, it would certainly be front of mind for me.
One of the things you touched on, Karma, was resilience, and we were talking earlier a bit about that. Do you think people actually understand what resilience looks like?
I think that's really hard because none of us really know what the climate's going to throw at us. So we don't know exactly what we have to prepare for. So from my point of view, it's about making no regrets investments quickly, and then having the flexibility and the agility to adapt to whatever it is that actually materialises in due course. So it's really difficult. It's not something that you can, just tick off your list and say that's done now. I think it's something that you have to continually look at and adapt to. But I think it is important that we start dealing with the aspects that we can as soon as possible.
And then you also touched on the fact that the water industry is the only industry that's committed to a 2030 net carbon neutral sector. And again, do you think that's something that's achievable by that date? Do you think it's too stretching a target?
No, I'm not an expert on these things, but I think it's fantastic that the industry has stepped up in that way, and it can hold its head and shoulders up among other sectors, having made that commitment 20 years ahead of the wider economy. I think it probably is achievable, but it will require investment and it will require quick action. If you think about that, that's only 10 years away. So we can't really afford to sit around for a couple of years deciding how to do it. Clearly, you need to plan. I think the industry anticipates having a delivery overview plan in place by about April next year, and then it will be a matter of getting on with it. And there's various levers you can pull, some of which are better understood than others. So things like electrifying fleets, you can draw widely from other sectors that have already gone down that road. But if you're looking at things like decarbonising water and wastewater treatment processes, obviously there's not a neat book that you can just pull out and open. So there will be some things that are more certain and some things that are less certain, but I like to think it is achievable.
Okay, well that's good. That's positive at least. And one of the things that the water companies are being sort of pushed to do is increase social value. So how would you define social value? Because obviously you had a very successful social contract summit, and lots of people were talking about it at that conference. So how would you define it?
Okay, so I'll give it a little bit of context. So it's an issue that we as a magazine have been championing for about a year to 18 months. And essentially, I mean, there isn't a neat definition. It's not something that everyone kind of agrees exactly what it is. But essentially, what we're trying to champion is that water companies, as essential service providers that sit at the heart of life and society, could think about delivering more value for society and the environment, as well as their paying customers. So it's about doing more for more people and going beyond what you're actually required to do to, I suppose, be a responsible business. And the summit that you referred to was on the 5th of November, and it brought the industry together to talk about those issues in quite a bit of detail. And thank you for your contribution.
Thank you.
I think I was struck by two things. One of them being the progress that we've made in a year. So we had a summit a year previously, and at that time it was purely a concept. It was really about challenging companies, you know, could you do this?
Right.
And this time, a year on, if you think about it, we've got sector level public interest commitment, which has, as you mentioned, decarbonisation, but it's got a number of other goals that the companies have signed up to. We've got individual companies having taken actions on their own, in their own areas and on their own terms. And we've got Ofwat having adopted public value as one of the key planks of its strategy. So we've come a long way, and there is, you know, it was clear on the day, there is a huge appetite in this sector for taking it further.
So who do you think is leading the way then and setting examples in terms of what good social contract looks like?
Well, in terms of individual companies, you mean?
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously Bristol Water has published the industry's first social contract. So this is an agenda they've been working on for a long time, and fair play to them, they've got something out there and they're very passionate about it. Obviously, we've also had Anglian Water change its Articles of Association to basically put delivering for society on a par with delivering for shareholders. So that's a really fundamental change. And other companies are looking at how best they can embed public purpose. So for some it might be articles, for others it might be a licence condition or possibly other routes. And you know that we had lots of water companies keen to support that event and to take part in it, and they all had things to say. So while some have kind of moved ahead in the short term, there is a lot of activity going on, different companies taking different approaches, and I think that's actually a good thing. Obviously we've got the high level public interest commitment at a sector level, but it is a contract with your citizens and your customers, so I personally think that delivering on a local level is a positive thing.
So one of the things around the social contract was also the supply chain and the supply community, because the supply community is made up of the water companies, consultants, contractors, manufacturers, suppliers, and so on. But then as part of that supply community, you've obviously got supply chain companies who are then providing services to their own sort of local water companies or others in the region.
Yeah.
So, and I sort of envisaged that the same way that all the customers, the millions of customers were interviewed, could there not be the same sort of level of engagement with the supply chain? Because as British Water, we do our own survey of water company performance with the supply chain. And I would love to see that a part of the sort of social contract. And do you think that kind of fits within that?
Okay, so I think, it is early days for this concept. As I say, it's really only been about a year that we've been exploring it in any depth. But absolutely, I mean, this is going to be a really difficult thing to deliver, and the supply chain companies are obviously a huge part of delivery. So from my perspective, yes, they definitely need to be brought into the conversation. I mean, I would encourage them, your members, to put themselves forward and to look at the agenda and see what they could contribute to it, and don't wait to be asked, to sort of step up and put forward if they think they've got a skill or some knowledge or expertise to contribute. But I do think what you've suggested kind of goes into a bigger point really, which is that, I mean, I've been very positive about what's been achieved in a short space of time, but something that came out of the summit was that really this needs to be mainstreamed and this needs to be delivered at pace. So, while it is great what we've seen so far, that is not the end of the story by any means. And it's really going to be quite challenging. So clearly there's practical things that need to be done on the ground to make this meaningful for customers and for citizens. But there's also a cultural change that's needed in the industry. I mean, essentially what we're asking people to do is to prioritise things that, may have had some weight before, but no way near as much as shareholder value. Mm-hmm. So we're actually asking people to think about making decisions in a different way and to factor in things that have never had such prominence before. So that is a huge change. It's kind of going beyond the bottom line and looking at other values. And the other factor is cost. So, clearly, how do we pay for this is a critical issue. And Ofwat's position, you're probably aware, is that, we should look at low cost or ideally no cost options. And you can see why they say that. I mean, it's the regulator's place to look out for the consumer and to not allow companies to kind of pile costs on in the name of social value. But if you think about the scale of some of these challenges that we're talking about, for me, there isn't really time to just pursue cheap options if there are better options that would carry some kind of cost. So we need to minimise the cost, but for me, the outcome is the most important element. Particularly if we're talking about something like climate change, okay, we've got a decade to get on top of that. And if we spend the first 5 years of that decade, so this AMP, really just pursuing no-cost options, that's 5 years gone. So anything the supply chain, to go back to your original point, anything that the supply chain can do in terms of partnering, collaborating, contributing, that's going to be fantastic, and I'm sure the companies would really welcome that.
Absolutely, and I think this sort of comes on to the next point about how can we measure social value. How can we measure these social contracts that these water companies are having to put in place? And I know that was one of the topics that was discussed at the conference.
Yeah, and it's really difficult. And I think I've probably heard I shouldn't say every, but a lot of different views on this, right? From people who advocate a particular methodology to people who say, actually, you can't measure this stuff. It's not things that fit into neat categories and you tick it off and that's done. If you look at it like that, you're missing the point. And I can see that that's got some weight behind it. But I do think we need to have a system of monitoring how well companies are delivering and how much they're delivering. And I think another critical point is, with the best will in the world, we are not going to be able to deliver everything for everybody all of the time. So there will have to be trade-offs. There will have to be choices made. As companies, we are going to prioritise X over Y. So for me, if there was some kind of framework that was set out, a kind of almost like a hierarchy of priorities, and a rationale to back that up, whether that's customer research or supply chain research or whatever it is, if you've got a logical, transparent framework that you then make decisions around, that to me is going to be a really valuable element. And I'm certainly not an expert on the metrics, but something that I think does inherently appeal to me is this 6 capitals framework. So that's essentially looking at financial capital as one element of a decision-making process that features lots of different elements. So that will be natural capital, social capital, and so on. So as I say, I'm not an expert on that, but I think that does naturally seem to lend itself well to me, to this subject.
So now we're going to move on to PR19, and one of the big, obviously, things that people are going to be waiting for towards the end of the year.
My favourite subject.
So, okay, mastermind. That's a mastermind question for you then. So what sort of highlights do you expect to see from PR19 and the final determinations?
Okay. Well, I'm not sure I'd call them highlights, but I think if we're looking at it purely from a customer perspective, the man or the woman on the street, I think we already know pretty much what we're going to see. And that's good news, that is good news. So it's going to be quite significant bill cuts. And it was 12% on average at the draft determination stage. It might not be exactly that, but it will probably be in that ballpark. We're going to see companies being asked to deliver more in terms of things that matter to customers, and a decent sort of solid investment package. So on that level, we can almost already tell the story. But then if you look at it as people that are involved in the sector or people that follow the sector in more detail, I think the crucial question will be whether the package that Ofwat puts forward on the 16th is considered acceptable and achievable by each individual company. And that will basically depend on exactly how much efficiency challenge Ofwat has built in, and exactly what the companies are being asked to deliver for the money that's been allowed. And I think, if you look at the draft determinations, companies didn't mince their words. I mean, obviously not all of them, but there were a fair number that said, if the final determination is the same as the draft, we cannot accept this. So the question will be how effectively have they been able to make their arguments? How much, if anything, has Ofwat moved? And once that package is on the table, the companies and their shareholders will have to look at it, and they will have to think, can we swallow this? I mean, I don't think there's going to be many people that are going to be, punching the air with joy. It's going to be a matter of, can we swallow this and get on with delivering it? Or is it so unacceptable that we'll have to appeal? And I mean, historically, we haven't had that many CMA appeals. There's been maybe one each price review for the last few years. But it is looking like this time around, it is possible that we will have multiple CMA referrals. Obviously, that's not set in stone. It all depends on the final numbers. But it is possible. And that would be quite a change. And it's not something that any company would relish. It's not, it's quite a high risk strategy. The outcome is uncertain. The process is quite onerous, and it's quite distracting for companies when they could be getting on with delivering. So it's not something that anyone would jump at. But if they consider that the challenges are just too great, they may feel that they've got no choice but to do that.
And I think one of the things that I've been hearing is that sometimes the determinations or the initial determinations weren't maybe taking into consideration some of the sort of local issues that some of the water companies had to address. And I think some of the arguments have been that the targets have been far too stretching for some of them as opposed to maybe some of the others. And I don't know if you've been getting that sort of same impression.
There are some generic issues, I think, that you've alluded to there that we can pick up on that are kind of, I suppose, bones of contention or really critical elements. So one of them will be cost efficiency. So essentially, the story behind that is quite interesting. So if you cast your mind back to September 2018, when the companies put their business plans in, the total industry spend was pitched at £56 billion. In January, which was Ofwat's first kind of initial assessment of plans, Ofwat basically said, well, we think there's a 13% gap between what you want to spend and what we think you should be spending. And then companies kind of, tweaked things and adjusted things where they could. But essentially in April, a lot of them went back and said, well, if we deliver according to your cost efficiency ideas, we will not be able to deliver everything that we've promised our customers. We would be underfunding capital maintenance. We won't be able to invest in resilience as the government has told us to. So there was quite a kind of pushback from companies. But then come July, draft determinations, Ofwat pretty much, there were some adjustments, but it pretty much held its line from January. And that gap between the industry's view of efficient costs and Ofwat's stood at about 11%. Right. So it hasn't really closed very much from January. And how individual companies responded to that, I think, is really interesting. So some of them that have got a smaller gap, I'm sure, have worked with Ofwat to come to a mutually agreeable place. So obviously that's what you would hope for. But if you look at some of the companies that have larger cost efficiency gaps, they've taken some interesting routes. So if you take, for example, Thames Water and Anglian Water, two companies, big gaps, Thames Water's response was effectively to put forward another option for Ofwat and say, well, okay, we understand you are concerned about bills, and therefore here's a suggestion of I think they called it a low-cost, low-investment option. So yes, we can deliver the price reductions that you want, but we won't be able to deliver everything that we said before, but this is what we can deliver. Whereas Anglian Water effectively held their line and said, we actually really believe in our plan, and we believe that the investments that we suggested are essential for resilience, to meet customer demand and government policy. So how that plays out is going to be really interesting, whether Ofwat changes its opinion or it doesn't. That's going to be crucial. So what those cost efficiency gaps are remaining at final determination stage. So that's one thing. It would be remiss of me not to mention cost of capital. I know it's a bit geeky, but for investors and shareholders, that's going to be the crucial number. And that, I'm sure you're aware, that's been on a kind of downward trajectory for some time. Gone are the days when it was over 5%. They look like luxury now. Somebody referred to a potential doomsday scenario of 2% cost of capital. Obviously that's not set in stone yet, we'll have to see, but I do think probably the number that was used at draft determination will probably come down because the markets have continued to go down in that period of time. So that's going to be crucial. And that plays into issues around financeability of companies and what their ratings are. The ratings agency Moody's has commented that it's possible that the average sector rating will go down a notch, and obviously that will have huge consequences for companies. So that's another thing. And for me personally, something I'd be interested to look out for will be how well aligned the actual package that is presented on the 16th matches what customers said they wanted in the first place. Because
that would be crucial.
As you've alluded to earlier, there was huge amounts of research done. Millions of customers contacted, surveyed, played games, all sorts of things to get their views across. So I think that kind of plays into the issue of who's actually calling the shots here. Is it the customers, or is it Ofwat acting as a proxy for customers? I'd just be really interested to see how those two align.
Great, thank you. So then my questions move on to the future then for the water industry. And you were talking about earlier that the water industry needs to be rehabilitated. So I just wanted to get your views a bit more, what that looks like to you, and what do you mean by that statement? Somebody at a conference, was not my words, but he described the other day as the industry seems a bit friendless at the moment. You'll be aware that when we've talked a little bit about the Labour Party policy, and they fundamentally think the model is failing and want to change it. Yeah. But even the
government, has been quite critical of the companies in terms of their financial arrangements and some of their operational failings. So going forward, and that's partly what the social contract agenda is about, I think a critical question for the sector is going to be, has it addressed the criticisms that have been levied at it? And to a good, there's definitely been a willingness to listen and to change. And to be fair to Ofwat, they've played a crucial part in that with their reform agenda. And how the other crucial thing for me is how well the companies and the sector generally can tell their story. Because I think for a long time, being a silent service provider was seen as a good thing. As long as everything worked, we didn't really have to have much of a public face. And I think that has been shown in the bad times to have not stood the companies in very good stead. They haven't had that kind of credit in the bank to fall back on. So I think going forward, it's not only about addressing issues and doing better and contributing more, it's also about telling a better story and being, I suppose, portraying the fact that water is absolutely fundamental to society, to life, to business, to the economy. Virtually nothing can work without it.
So how collectively do you think we could best do that?
Well, it would be great to see people pull together. Now, obviously, companies have their own communities to speak to, but there are some messages that could be joined up across regulators, government, companies, supply chain, customer groups. There have been an attempt at that with this Love Water campaign, but I think we kind of need to really bolster that and sort of hammer home the fact that water is a hugely valuable commodity that's not reflected in the price we pay for it, and everyone needs to work together and be on the same page and really reinforce those messages together.
So then I hope you don't mind, because then I think that the water report has got a pivotal role to play in that. Your water report is highly regarded, and I read it, and many people read it in the industry.
Thank you.
I think that as a publication and as a source of news and information, it's got a pivotal role to play in helping to deliver that message. So do you sort of see yourselves as part of that?
Well, thank you for your kind words, first of all. It's always lovely to have the feedback. Yes, we've always set out to be really constructive as a magazine. We're not there to trip anyone up. We're there to share information constructively and report things fairly and in a balanced way. And yes, anything we can do to facilitate those conversations or to kind of keep it on the agenda, we'll be, very happy to do. And I think we have concertedly tried, for example, to champion this social contract agenda, and I'm delighted that has got traction. So in some ways, it's a step on from that, isn't it? It's about mainstreaming it, which is what we need to do, and making the value of water known and cared about to all. So yes, I'll do my best, Lila, to
Good.
to play that part.
No, great, thank you. Karma, it's been absolutely great to hear your thoughts and insights, especially on the final determinations, which are coming out on the 16th of December that everyone's waiting for, and also the nationalisation agenda. So thank you so much for your time. And I particularly like your sort of thoughts in terms of what keeps the CEOs up at night, and also the stretching targets. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me, and really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.